One need be 8 centuries old to know what this massive architecture meant to its builders, wrote Henry Adams in his book Mont Saint-Michel in Chartres, more than 100 years ago. Mont Saint-Michel has gone through several major transformations since Adams' time, and is in the midst of another one now that will add to its story once again. Mont Saint-Michel has been so many different things in the course of its long life, since its founding in the early 8th century, when the Bishop of Avranches built a church dedicated to the Archangel Michael on a rock of granite in the sea. It was originally the hopeful assertion of Christianity in a Europe that was still largely pagan and victim to Viking raids of the northern coasts of what would become France. The story of the Abbey's origin tells us that one night in the year 708, the Archangel Michael, leader of God's armies against Satan, appeared to Saint Aubert, the Bishop of Avranches, in a dream. The Archangel ordered the bishop to build a sanctuary in his name atop of Mont A, the mountain of the fallen. Aubert ignored this order. After all, it was only a dream, and the idea of the great angel ordering him to build a sanctuary on top such a treacherous place was preposterous. The next night, the Archangel appeared again and repeated his order to build a sanctuary at the top of Mont A for the people of God, which he himself would ordain in the name of the Lord as his seat of waiting in preparation for the coming return of Satan. The Abbey would serve as a reminder to man that heaven was aligned with earth against the dark forces of the fallen dragon. Again, Aubert was unconvinced, and in any case, building a church of all churches on such a forsaken, overgrown, and rocky terrain atop an isolated mount surrounded by the sea would be an impossible task. Thus, it suited the bishop to ignore this recurring dream. Perplexed with such a doubting bishop, Saint Michael realized that if faith would not convince him, then he would need to use his powers of persuasion. As Aubert slept the following night, the Archangel Michael pressed his finger into Aubert's forehead, and with a voice inconceivable to man, echoed his command throughout the stubborn bishop's skull. Aubert awoke, shaken the next morning, to find that the Archangel had burned a hole in his head. He needed no further convincing, and in late 709, convinced by the bishop's story, and the hole in his skull to boot, the Duke of Normandy, out of faith, or just fear of suffering the wrath of the Archangel by ignoring his request, gifted the site to the Benedictine monks, who began building the ambitious Abbey Church under the patronage of William the Conqueror, the expression of a richer, more confident era, as the Normans, who were formerly Vikings, were about to set out on not only the conquest of England, but also of Sicily and southern Italy. The abbey atop the mount became a major pilgrimage site. There were even relics sold here as souvenirs in the Middle Age, a hub of ecclesiastical and political power. It was also a major center of education, with a rich library and scriptorium. At the time of the 100 Years' War, the church evolved into a military citadel, an impregnable fortress in the sea, the only spot in Normandy that never fell to the English. During and after this conflict, Mont Saint-Michel assumed many of its current features: the ramparts that line the handsome stone walls, and the statue of Saint Michael. An iron statue coated in gold of the great leader of the armies of God himself, Michael, whose name means he who is like God, now stands some 300 feet in the air, his sword held triumphantly aloft as his heel crushes the dark dragon. Building on such treacherous ground, a small rock in a bay that contains some of Europe's strongest currents and most powerful tides, must have seemed an ultimate act of faith. For the pilgrims flocking to pay homage to the Archangel, the trip to reach this heavenly precinct was indeed a true test of faith. Centuries ago, the shore was a full 7 kilometers or 4 miles from the island. 5 kilometers farther than it is today. One had to wait until low tide, when the sea receded and left a flat strand of grayish mud, and get the timing right. The crossing on foot could be dangerous. High tide can rise up to 45 feet and sweep in at some 200 feet per minute. Moreover, at low tide, the gray clay-like sand can suddenly give way to pools of quicksand, trapping any unsuspecting traveler in what certainly must have seemed like a bottomless pit. In 1318, 18 pilgrims drowned in the bay, and another dozen died in the quicksand. Now, there are organized treks with trained guides. Even so, groups of tourists do still get caught in the sand and need rescuing. With time, Mont Saint-Michel has lost more and more of its status as an island. The relentless flow of the tides, bringing in their wake alluvial soil ideal for the growth of vegetation, has left the soil near the shore extremely fertile, and the people of Normandy, like those in Holland, gradually started using dikes and irrigation systems to reclaim the land, pushing out the edge of the shore and bringing more of the land by the sea under cultivation. The salty grass that grows on the sandy ground as the sea proceeds makes for excellent grazing, and the sheep raised in the area are treasured for their flavor. The buildup had pushed its way to within 2 kilometers of Mont Saint-Michel by the 19th century, and might have reached all the way had there not been a movement to stop it and preserve the island nature of the ancient church. With the French Revolution, the Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel was closed, like many church buildings, and it was turned into a prison. What a strange place is this Mont Saint-Michel, wrote Victor Hugo in 1836. All around us, as far as one can see, infinite space, the blue horizon of the sea, the green horizon of the earth, clouds, air, freedom, birds in full flight, ships with full sails, and then, all of a sudden, there, in the crack of an old wall, above our heads, through a barred window, the pale face of a prisoner. He called it the Pyramids of the Seas. 19th century legendary French short story novelist Guy de Maupassant's work, The Legend of Mont Saint-Michel, offers another interesting take on the origin of the Mont, as accounted to him from a group of Benedictine monks. He accounts the take as follows. I had first seen it from Cancale, this fairy castle in the sea. I got an indistinct impression of it, as of a gray shadow outlined against the misty sky. I saw it again from Avranches at sunset. The immense stretch of sand was red. The horizon was red. The boundless bay was dead. The rocky castle rising out through the distance like a weird, signorial residence, like a dream palace, strange and beautiful. This alone remained black in the crimson light of the dying day. The following morning at dawn, I went toward it across the sands. My eyes fastened on this gigantic jewel, as big as a mountain, cut like a cameo, and as dainty as lace. The nearer I approached, the greater my admiration grew, for nothing in the world could be more wonderful or more perfect. As surprised as if I had discovered the habitation of God, I wandered through those halls, supported by frail and massive columns, raising my eyes in wonder to those spires which witnessed like fireworks starting for the sky, and to that marvelous assemblage of towers, of angels, of slender and charming ornaments, a regular sprint of stone, granite lace, a masterpiece of colossal and delicate architecture. As I was looking up in ecstasy, a lower Norman peasant came up to me and told me the story of the great quarrel between Saint Michael and the devil. A skeptical genius had said of the Mont, quote, God made man in his image, and man has returned the compliment. This saying is an eternal truth, and it would be very curious to write the history of the local divinity of every continent as well as the history of the patron saints in each one of our provinces. The barbarian has his ferocious man-eating idols. The polygamist fills his paradise with women. The Greeks, like a practical people, defy all passion. Every village in France is under the influence of some protecting saint, modeled according to the characteristics of the inhabitants. Saint Michael watches over Lower Normandy. Saint Michael, the radiant and victorious angel, the sword carrier, the hero of heaven, the victorious, the conqueror of Satan. But this is how the Lower Norman peasant, cunning, deceitful, and tricky, understands and tells of the struggle between the great saint and the devil. To account wretched deeds of the devil, Saint Michael descended to earth and built himself, in the open ocean, this habitation worthy of an archangel, and only such a saint could build a residence of such magnificence. Ever watchful over the wicked one, he surrounded his domains by quicksands, more treacherous even than the sea. The devil lived in a cottage on a hill, but he owned all the salt marshes, the rich lands where grow the finest crops, the wooded valleys, and all the fertile hills of the country were under his claim, while the saint ruled only over the sands. Therefore, Satan was rich, whereas Saint Michael was as poor as a church mouse. After a few years of fasting, the saint grew tired of this state of affairs and began to think of some way to take the rich lands from the devil. But the matter was by no means easy, as Satan kept a good hold on his fruiting lands. He thought the thing over for about 6 months. Then, one morning, he walked across the shore. The devil was eating in front of his door when he saw the saint. He eagerly rushed toward him, kissed the hem of his sleeve, and invited him in. Saint Michael drank a bowl of milk and then began. "I have come here to propose to you a good bargain." The devil, candid and trustful, answered, "Oh, that will suit me." "Here it is," replied Michael. "Give me all your lands." Satan, growing alarmed, wished to speak, but Michael continued, "Listen first. Before you speak, give me all your lands. I will take care of all the work, the plowing, the sowing, the fertilizing, everything, and we shall share in the crops equally. Doesn't the idea of not toiling over turnips suit you?" The devil, who was naturally lazy, accepted. He only demanded in addition a few of those delicious gray mullet which are caught around the sanctuary mount. Saint Michael promised the beast the fish. They grasped hands and spat on the ground to show that it was a bargain. And the saint continued, "See here, so that you will have nothing to complain of. Choose that part of the crops which you prefer, the part that grows above ground or the part that stays in." Satan cried out, "I will take all that will be above ground." "It is done," said the saint, and he went away. 6 months later, all over the immense domain of the devil, one could see nothing but carrots, turnips, and onions, all the plants whose juicy roots are good and savory, and whose useless leaves are good for nothing but animal feed. Satan wished to break the contract, calling Saint Michael a swindler, but the saint, who had developed quite a taste for agriculture, went back to see the devil and said, "Really? I hadn't thought of that at all. It was just an accident, no fault of mine. And to make things fair with you, this year, I'll let you take everything that is under the ground." "Very well then," answered Satan. The following spring, all the evil spirit's lands were covered with golden wheat, oats as big as beans, flax, magnificent red clover, peas, cabbage, artichoke, everything that develops into grains or fruit in the sunlight. Once more, Satan received nothing, and this time, he completely lost his temper. He took back his fields and remained deaf to all the fresh propositions of his neighbor. A whole year rolled by. From the top of his lonely manor, St. Michael looked at the distant and fertile lands and watched the devil direct man to the work, take in his crops, and thresh the wheat. And he grew angry at how slow man provided for him. No longer able to deceive Satan, he decided to wreak vengeance on him, and he went out to invite him to dinner for the following Monday. "You have been very unfortunate in your dealings with me," he said. "I know it. But I don't want any added ill between our already large list of reckonings, and I expect you to dine with me." Satan, who was as greedy as he was hungry, accepted eagerly. On the day appointed, he donned his finest attire and set out for the castle. St. Michael sat him down to a magnificent meal. First there were meatballs, then 2 big gray mullet with citrus drizzle, a turkey stuffed with chestnuts soaked in wine, some salt marsh lamb as tender as cake, vegetables which melted in the mouth, and nice hot pancakes which was brought on smoking and spreading a delicious odor of butter. They drank new, sweet sparkling cider and heady red wine, and after each course, they whetted their appetites with some old apple brandy. The devil drank and ate to his heart's content. In fact, he gorged so much that he began to vomit, laughingly, then proceeded to fill himself once more. St. Michael arose in anger and cried in a voice like thunder, "What? Before me? You dare? Before me?" Satan, terrified, ran away, and the saint, seizing a stick, pursued him. They ran through the halls, turning round the pillars, running up the staircases, galloping along the cornices, jumping from gargoyle to gargoyle. The devil, who was woefully exhausted now, was running about madly and trying hard to escape. At last, he found himself at the top of the last terrace, right at the top, from which could be seen the immense bay with its distant towns, sands, and pastures. He could no longer escape, and the saint came up behind him and gave him a furious kick, which shot him through space like a cannon. He shot through the air like a javelin and fell heavily toward the town of Mont A. His horns and claws stuck deep into the rock, which keeps through eternity the traces of one of Satan's falls. He stood up again, limping, crippled until the end of time, and as he looked at this fatal castle in the distance, standing out against the setting sun, he understood well that he would always be vanquished in this unequal struggle, and he went away limping, heading for distant countries. And this is how St. Michael, the patron saint of Normandy, vanquished the devil. In 2005, the French government, which owns the abbey, began work on a major project to restore the maritime character of Mont Saint-Michel. The buildup of silt was gradually reducing the parts of the bay that filled up with water at high tide, and, according to some studies, if nothing were to be done, the island would find itself permanently connected to the mainland by 2040. The French central state, together with the regional governments of Normandy and Brittany, and the European Union, undertook a massive and expensive renovation project, budgeted at nearly $300 million. The main features of the project included the destruction of the old causeway to allow the sea to move freely around Mont Saint-Michel, and the construction of a light bridge or walkway in its stead. A dam on the Cousnon River to hold water during high tide and then release it when the tide recedes, to push sand away from the island. The destruction of a large parking lot at the foot of the Mont, and the construction of a parking area on the mainland with a shuttle bus service to bring tourists and employees to and from the island. The initial impression of the Mont, as one makes one's way from the shuttle bus, is decidedly more commercial than spiritual. The village of Mont Saint-Michel, which grew up around the church, is tiny, with a full-time population of roughly 50. Its narrow, medieval streets are quickly crowded with tourists, who, shoulder to shoulder, 4 or 5 thick, mill about like subway commuters at rush hour. Among its many meanings, Mont Saint-Michel is the goose that laid the golden egg. Designated a World Heritage Site by UNESCO, Mont Saint-Michel has between 2 and 2.8 million visitors per year. With each tourist leaving behind about $25, that means an annual flow of some 63 million into a tiny town of 240 acres, about 1/3 of a square mile. The French state has 99 official national monuments. 5 sites pay for the upkeep of the other 94. And yet, only about 1 million of the 2 million visitors actually take the trouble to visit the abbey. The other 1.2 to 1.6 million are spending their time and money in the shops and restaurants, as well as for historical museums. Cheesy establishments with wax figures emphasizing the more lurid aspects of the local history, with a heavy emphasis on the prison and the more brutal forms of torture once practiced there. 3 of these museums are owned by the former mayor. In some ways, the trip to the top offers a modern version of the journey through life, a kind of divine comedy, if you will. The way up is demanding. One must pass through the tourist hell of the town below and make one's way up to the increasingly steep ascent to the abbey, where many must pause to catch their breath after one or other of a seemingly infinite set of stairs. As one ascends, the crowd thins, discouraged by the demanding climb. Suddenly, as one approaches the top, the view opens up. The horizon widens. One can see the immense and glorious bay. The sand and water glisten in the sun. All is quiet, aside from the occasional cry of a seabird. The climb is, though, well worth the burden. The abbey is one of the great living expressions of European medieval architecture. The builder's genius was called forth by the extreme difficulties of constructing a massive complex on the narrow summit of a jagged piece of granite rock, some 260 feet above the sea. Had the abbey been built on flat ground, it would no doubt have been a large, horizontal complex of buildings with a church, courtyards, cloisters, and so forth, all on the same level. Instead, there was not enough room for a large church on the top of the mountain. But rather than build a small one, they built into the side of the mountain an ingenious, massive structure on 3 levels. The church, appropriately, sits atop the whole structure, opening onto a terrace of amazing view, but only about half of it sits solidly on rock. The other half, called the choir, is perched somewhat perilously on top of the 2 levels of building below. The original building held up for about 400 years, from the time of William the Conqueror in 1050 until about 1420, when its massive Norman pillars crashed down into the monks' dormitory below, fortunately killing no one. And so, all that is left of the original church is 3 gorgeous sculpted Norman columns, whose graceful, sober simplicity and strength are the architectural equivalent of the army of the 40,000 knights with which its patron, William the Conqueror, crossed the English Channel and conquered England. The choir was rebuilt in the late 1400s in a different style that the French call Gothique flamboyant, with high, slender, delicately carved arches and tall bays of stained glass windows that flood the front of the church with light. Although separated by nearly half a millennium, the 2 halves of the church seem remarkably harmonious. It is only after a while, and perhaps a guided tour, that one becomes aware that they are quite different. As Henry Adams wrote, "Although the 2 structures are some 500 years apart, they live pleasantly together. The choir is charming, far more charming than the nave, as the beautiful woman is more charming than the elderly man." Just beyond the choir is the magnificent 13th century 3-story structure. It contains a gorgeous cloister with a double row of delicately carved arches and a refectory where the powerful abbots once entertained and where, as in Henry Adams's account, jongleurs would have recited the Song of Roland for the entertainment of the assembled company. Underneath is a handsome and well-lit room where the monks copied manuscripts for the abbey's famous library. In the cellar is an enormous wooden wheel that served, among other things, as a winch to haul water and other supplies up the north side of the Mont. It is sobering to recall that virtually all of the stone and building materials were brought here by boat, much of it hauled up from the sea by rope. The vast, cavernous lower depths of the Abbey complex also served as a prison. Even as early as the 15th century, the kings of France supposedly sent prisoners here. Some prisoners spent their days turning the massive wheel to haul goods up to the Abbey. Today, the Abbey is shared by something of an odd couple pair of occupants: the very secular French state, in the form of the administrator in charge of Mont Saint-Michel as a national monument, and the monastic fraternity of Jerusalem, a French religious order that has occupied the Abbey since 2001 and pays a nominal rent to the government. For the most part, the two get along, but the state has an economic interest in getting as many people as possible to take the official tour, as well as use the site for concerts and cultural events. The monks and nuns view the Abbey as a religious setting, and no tours are conducted during religious services, which occur 3 times a day. Subtly and poetically, a new dam project offers both a mirror and a reading of Mont Saint-Michel. The water coming from the dam is only a tiny factor, pushing against the larger forces of nature at work in the bay. Many are skeptical of the work being done now to preserve the Mont. The buildup of sand, accumulating every day, is the inevitable result of the powerful force of the sea. The tide coming in is stronger than the tide going out. As a result, the tide leaves more sand than it carries away. Many fail to see how this project could reverse that. It is a race against time. The grassy patches in the sand have receded somewhat since the dam became operational, but no one knows whether the project will succeed in its ultimate goal, making sure that Mont Saint-Michel remains an island. But what we do know is that if we do nothing, the shore will reach the Mont. Whether or not you believe this is truly the earthly dwelling of the commander of the armies of heaven, or that it is simply a monument to his glory, is inconsequential to its beauty. The Mont of Saint-Michel endures, be its purposes for man's eyes and imagination, or Michael's earthly dwelling and shining reminder that man is not alone in its struggles against the darkness